to work. Mm-hmm. Seems a little awkward.
Good morning to everybody on this rainy Tuesday morning. Thanks for coming today. I'm Kira Larson. If I haven't met you yet, I'm in the Stanford Center for Clinical Research. We host these lectures every month, usually. We do not have one scheduled for July, but the rest of the year should be full. Next month, we are hosting Andy Chang, who is going into cardiovascular fellowship. He's going to be coming and talking about common cardiovascular diseases. So look for that flyer. It should be going out hopefully by the end of this week, if not next week. Same sign-up process. So I'll just begin by introducing our two speakers for today. We're going to be talking to us about the kidney function and dysfunction, why it's important to all of us and patients and clinical research participants. So Brian Brady completed his medical school training in Philadelphia at Jefferson Medical College and remained in Philadelphia to pursue his internal medicine residency at Temple. And he came to Stanford to start his research fellowship in nephrology with an interest in chronic kidney disease and population health. His research at Stanford's Clinical Excellence Research Center, also known as CERC, has focused on designing a care delivery model to help healthcare systems use prescription medications more effectively in an attempt to lower total healthcare spending. Our second speaker is Christi Bradshaw. She completed her medical school training in Louisville at the University of Louisville and then completed her residency at Mount Sinai Beth Israel in New York before coming here. Christi is in her third year of nephrology fellowship and is interested in global health work, specifically in assessing the financial and psychosocial impact of end-stage renal disease in low and middle income countries. So please help me in welcoming both our speakers this morning.
Thank you. I guess I'm told we have to use the microphone so the recording works. I'm sorry it seems a little awkward for such a small crowd, but welcome everyone. I'm Brian. This is Christi. You heard a little bit about our background. I have always been jealous of Christi in that she gets to travel around the world for her research, and I'm stuck here in Palo Alto, which there are worse places, but can everyone hear me okay at the start? Since it's a fairly small crowd, we have about 50 slides or so. We will probably not take up all of your 2 hours. We'll be respectful of your time. There's a video in the middle of the talk to break it up. If people would like a break, I'll pause around 10 to see if people need to use the restroom or something like that. I thought just so Christi and I know a little bit more about the audience, if we could get a sense of where in the kind of field of medicine, spectrum of medicine people are from, that would help us greatly in how we present and frame some of the materials. So cardiology, oncology, endocrine, maybe people could just offer a few areas where they're from. So Christi and I know more about who we're talking to. Cool. Nephrology? Psychiatry? Okay, cool. Are there any kidney-specific topics that people were interested in hearing about? Because, as I say, we have lots of slides, and we're going to try and cover everything from soup to nuts, from structure to physiology to disease to treatment. We apologize, many of these slides could be talks in and of themselves. So if we are going into too much detail, or conversely, if we're rushing, please just raise your hand and ask for clarification. We want this to be really informal. There's a hand up there. Great. One of our research partners at my research center with whom we're working to improve kidney disease delivery care is Mount Sinai. It's a terrific kidney program. Just a show of hands, this is a great segue into our talk. How many people know a friend or family member with kidney disease? pretty prevalent. How many people know a friend or family member on dialysis or with a transplant? Okay. I think kidney disease, Christi and I were just speaking before the talk. A lot of people know about dialysis. A lot of people know kidney disease is a horrendous thing. Our title is a brief overview of the kidney, an understated organ that keeps us balanced. I hope that by the end of the talk you'll kind of see why we chose that title. I mean no offense to cardiology or oncology as we go through, but I think many people will agree that on the national front, both in terms of research funding and in terms of what you see on commercials and what you read in the New York Times, there's quite a bit written about upcoming trends in oncology and cardiology. And I think if you don't already, we hope that by the end of the talk you'll have an appreciation of how neat and understated our organ is. So the outline for today, like I said, we want this to be informal, so please stop and ask questions as we go along. We'll briefly go over the origins of nephrology. We'll spend some time on the kidney's many functions. We'll take some time to go through the diseases of the kidney. We'll take some additional time to focus on one particular disease of the kidney because of its importance, both from a clinical and health policy standpoint, and that is end-stage renal disease, otherwise known as ESRD. And then I think try and end the talk with some clinical considerations that are related to the kidney that we like to think about all the time, but understand that people in other fields, when they're focused on their own area of clinical expertise, may not have the kidney at the forefront. And so we'll hope to bring that forward as we go through. A couple of fun facts. So the heart obviously is our body's blood pumping organ. We talk about percentage of cardiac output going to different organs of the body. The kidney gets 20% of the heart's total cardiac output or total blood volume. The only organ that gets more is the brain. I think the brain gets about 30%. I'm sure people know where the kidneys are, but they are immediately south of the heart and lungs, and one of the reasons why is because they require so much blood. So the heart pumps the blood out through the aorta, which is the major vessel that carries the blood everywhere, north and south in the body. And the first major organ on the aorta's roadmap, so to speak, is the kidneys. The renal arteries branch off the aorta just below the heart, and this is why. The kidneys filter your entire blood volume about 20 to 25 times per day, which comes out to about 180 liters of blood that they're filtering while you're sitting here digesting the potassium and calcium that you ate in the fruit and the phosphorus that you ate in the biscuits up there. While you sleep, they kind of never sleep. They're always working. The functional unit of the kidney, which you'll kind of see where that fits in a minute or two, is called the nephron. Each kidney has between 900,000 and 1 million of these tiny functional units. And these are really the workhorses of the kidney, and you'll see why as we go on. I wanted to spend a few 30 seconds or so on redundancy. We talk about total kidney mass or total kidney volume in nephrology, and what you'll see that the measurement of kidney function can go well above 100%, and some people ask us why that is. And it's because you're born with more kidney function than you need. And the good news about that is, there's lots of good news about that, but one of the major things that people focus on is you only need one. In fact, one of the international hashtags that's most famous in nephrology is hashtag you only need one, and that was started by a group who wanted to increase awareness of the idea of living kidney donation, meaning you can donate one of your kidneys and still be fine. To a friend or family member who might need one. I put this picture of a bowling alley here. I think it's really interesting. Each unit of the nephron has millions of tiny filters. And if you were to stretch all of them out, their total surface area would be that of a standard bowling alley. So these are our so-called friendly kidney beans. They sit in the retroperitoneal space in the lower back. Like I said, the two vessels there you can see coming in is where the 20% cardiac output arrives through. This is the kidney sectioned in half, This tan structure here, this is where the blood comes in from the heart here. The kidney does its thing, and then this tan structure is called the ureter. That's where the urine is produced. Eventually it goes to the bladder, and then you urinate it out. And the kidneys, one of the kidney's major functions, as you'll see, is taking the blood, filtering out the bad stuff, holding back the good stuff, and doing that over and over again. And the things that it doesn't want, the body doesn't want to keep, it gets rid of in the urine. This is the nephron. This is the functional unit of the kidney that does all of the work. These are, each of these kidneys has between 900,000 and 1 million of these functional units that I mentioned earlier. We won't go into obviously too much detail because these are usually hour-long lectures in med school for the different segments of this thing. But in short, the blood comes in here. This is where the 20% of the cardiac output comes. And this unit here, called the glomerulus, is really the brain of the kidney. This is the part of the kidney that does the thinking and decides what parts of the blood do I want to keep and what parts of the blood can I get rid of. The parts of the blood that the body decides it wants to keep, so the good stuff, so to speak, that continues to get pushed out of the kidney and returned to the circulation. The stuff that the kidney decides the body doesn't want to keep, it drops into this blue system, and this is the nephron, so-called tubules of the nephron. Each section of the nephron has different functions and different roles, but to sum it up or to say in short, this is where all of the regulation of electrolytes and water happens. So when we hear that the kidneys regulate our potassium and our sodium and our acid-base status, all of this is happening within these different segments of the nephron. And then as the kidney does its thing, it takes back what it wants and secretes what it doesn't want into this tubule. Eventually, this waste turns to urine, and the collecting ducts, they all converge into this structure. So all these millions of nephrons put out their waste into the ureter, and that's your urine. So show of hands, kidney has many functions. I've mentioned this. Obviously, the answer is not 1. Between 5 and 9, how many people think the kidney has 5? Show of hands. How many think it has 9? So it has 5. It doesn't quite have 9. We could make 9, but five large ones. So the 5 kind of physiologic classes of kidney functions I laid out here: filtration and metabolism. This is what everybody, I think, thinks about when they think about the kidney being the body's filter. Fluid regulation, we talked about. How does the kidney handle water? How does it regulate your volume status? So for the people from cardiology or heart failure, how does the kidney either prevent or cause swelling or edema? How does it balance the electrolytes that we consume without thinking about it and just manage everything so that all of our sodium, potassium, various salts are kept in perfect balance, and we never have to feel the ill effects of electrolytes that are out of balance? The kidney plays a large role in bone mineral metabolism. This is an area where probably most people have heard about this, but we'll just briefly go through how that works. This is a hormonal function of the kidney. And then also the kidney is responsible for the hormone that drives red blood cell production. So I leave this up here both to show you that I think most people could quickly rattle off that the kidney does functions 1 through 3. But I think the 2 hormonal functions in keeping your bones healthy, your calcium regulated, and then also being responsible for producing your red blood cells, these are hugely important, and some people just forget these. So this is starting to get into some of the stuff that hopefully you all will find interesting. How do we measure kidney function? Probably everyone here has heard of serum creatinine. This is the most common lab test that we use to establish how a patient's kidneys are functioning. It's not a perfect test, but it's the one that's most widely accepted. Probably, as many of you know, creatinine is a waste product that the muscles are generating all the time. Can people hear me in the back? My mic seems to be cutting in and out. It's okay, good. So the muscles are constantly generating creatinine as a waste product. And so if your kidneys are functioning really well, they just clear all this creatinine through the filtration system that I described. So you would never have more creatinine than you should. But what we found is that when people's kidneys start to function poorly or not clear waste as well as they should, people's creatinine levels in the blood start to rise. This, I hope, makes sense. The muscles are constantly producing creatinine. So if the clearance from the kidneys is not so hot, the levels in the blood are going to build up. And so we kind of talk about creatinine like golf. We want a low score. So the higher the creatinine, the worse somebody's kidney function is. BUN is another common measure of kidney function. It stands for blood urea nitrogen. Urea nitrogen is primarily a byproduct of all the proteins that you eat. So when they're broken down into amino acids, all the nitrogen groups on the amino acids are urinated out as waste products. So in the same way that if your blood has too much creatinine, if it has too much blood urea nitrogen, we know that your kidneys are not getting rid of it. Cystatin C is a newer measure of kidney function. Some people think it's more accurate than creatinine. I just show it so that you've heard the term. These can be categorized as residual waste, like I said. The production of these from the body is fairly constant. So if the number changes, then we think probably they're not being cleared and there's residual waste. Urine creatinine, so now we're looking at not what's in the blood, but what's in the urine. So the urine should have certain levels of creatinine that tell us how your kidneys are functioning. We can measure those. Urine should generally not have protein. One of the things that we tell patients is the two measures that we are most concerned about when we look at your kidneys are what's the creatinine level in the blood? This tells us how well the kidneys are clearing waste. And secondly, how does your urine look? If your urine has things in it that it shouldn't have in it, this also tips us off that the filtration system is probably not working as well as it should be. And protein is the most common molecule that we look for. So in general, that glomerular structure, that little tuft at the top of the nephron that I showed you, the filtration system is built such that the slits are too small to let protein through. And so if protein starts to show up in the urine in quantities that are higher than what make us comfortable, then that kind of tells us that the filtration system of each nephron is becoming incompetent. And so it can't, the tight junctions that keep the protein in the blood side are not functioning well. You'll see probably patients get 24-hour urines collected. Some people ask us why we would do this. This is kind of cumbersome for the patient. They have to walk around all day with a urine jug, which can be socially awkward sometimes. We were actually made to carry these around on call on a weekend so we could kind of feel the pain that a patient was going through, and they really are cumbersome. But they're the best, they're the gold standard for us to judge how well a patient's kidneys are functioning. This is a classic graph that we always get shown in medical school, and it basically just drives the point home that creatinine and GFR, which stands for glomerular filtration rate, that is how much volume each nephron or each kidney is filtering, are inversely related. So on the y-axis here, this is the filtration rate. It would make sense that we want this rate to be as high as possible. So we want your kidneys to be filtering as much as they possibly can. On the x-axis, we have plasma creatinine. This is the blood test that I was telling you about earlier. So you can see a normal creatinine is around 1. And if you follow that up to the line, that gives us a GFR of filtration rate around 100%. You can see that GFR goes well above 100%. This gets back to what I was saying before about redundancy, that people have more kidney function at birth than they need. The other reason why this graph is always shown and why I wanted to show it was to drive home the point that as creatinine starts to climb, you can see that the GFR drops precipitously. It's not a linear relationship. So if you look at moving from a creatinine of 1 to creatinine of 2, your GFR drops from about 100 to about 50%. So half of your kidney function theoretically is lost when your creatinine bumps from 1 to 2. And I think for people outside of nephrology, this point, though people have all heard it, is sometimes forgotten. And so people don't get so worked up about a creatinine of 1.8 or a creatinine of 2.1. They get much more worked up about a creatinine that's in the 4 or the 5 range. But you can see moving from a creatinine of even 3 to a creatinine of 4 is a much smaller decline in the filtration rate. This huge jump here moving from 1 to 2 is really where most of the patient's kidney function is lost. And so I just wanted to put this graph up there so people know we don't measure GFR from a lab. We measure creatinine, but that in our minds corresponds to GFR. Probably for those of you who have seen patients in trials or otherwise, they get very focused on, quote, what's my percent? And they ask Christi and I and other nephrologists this all the time. They want to know what percent of kidney function they have left, and that is the percent of GFR. So for many of our patients, by the time they see us, most of their kidney function is around 60% or their GFR is around 60%. Just for in terms of scope or scale, we don't start worrying about dialysis until the GFR is around 11 or 12. So you can really do well with very little kidney function. In fact, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, but patients in the 18 to 20 to 22 range, sometimes they feel fine, even though that they're functioning with 20% or 22% of their original kidney function. This gets at the point that I'll make later, which is I think kidney disease suffers from being a silent disease. There's no, chest pain or shortness of breath that's associated with kidney disease that patients with either cardiac disease or lung disease, they get symptomatic. They feel short of breath when they walk, or heart failure patients get lower extremity edema. Patients with kidney disease tend not to get symptoms, whether they're shortness of breath or electrolyte abnormalities or certainly edema, until their GFR is in the low 20s, high teens, sometimes even mid-teens range. And unfortunately, if you're presenting to us when you're starting to get these symptoms, the horse is way out of the barn and there's not a whole lot that we can do to get your kidney function back up to where it was. In fact, there's nothing we can do. One of the sad, unfortunate truths about kidney disease is it's not reversible. So once you lose nephron mass, once you lose those functional units with the tubules that I was showing you, right now we don't have a good way to get them back. And so what we do in nephrology is we manage patients the best we can to slow the progression or the decline of filtration rate. This is just a point that I wanted to make about thinking about the patient. So it's very easy for us as docs and people in the research world, anyone caring for patients, to look at a set of labs and just make an assessment based on the numbers. Creatinine, though, if you have a patient whose labs show a creatinine of 1.2 and another patient whose labs show a creatinine of 1.5, it's reasonable to think that the patient whose creatinine is 1.5 is probably worse or probably has more advanced kidney disease. But don't forget where creatinine comes from. It comes from the muscles. So if you're looking at a 35-year-old bodybuilder, they're going to be making a lot more creatinine to start than an 85-year-old frail grandmother type who's going to have lower muscle mass and be generating less creatinine. So for the bodybuilder, you may not be so concerned if their creatinine is 1.3 or 1.4 because they make so much creatinine. Conversely, though, if your 85-year-old grandmother's creatinine is 1.3 and she's 5'0" and 100 pounds, that actually might be pretty bad kidney disease because she doesn't generate that much creatinine to start with. Does that concept make sense? So albuminuria gets at how we measure protein in the urine. These are numbers that you'll probably see on inclusion and exclusion criteria, frankly. This is where a lot of kidney patients get pushed out of clinical trials. So albumin is just the most common form of protein that we see in the urine, and it's how the kidney societies have decided to evaluate kidney patients' urine and match how much albumin is in their urine to the severity of their kidney disease or the degree to which their filtration in the nephron is not working well because it's letting through too much protein. So less than 30 milligrams per day is just the unit that you'll see in all the labs, we don't get too worked up about that. That's normal to mildly increased. 30 to 299 milligrams per day. This is, well, there's albumin there, but we're not going to raise, the cavalry yet, but we're going to talk to people about your kidney filtration system isn't working perfectly. There's some things that you can do to get the amount of protein in your urine down. When the albuminuria or proteinuria, as some people use them interchangeably, gets above 300 milligrams per day, however, this is when we start to get really worried and when we jump on patients to do things, both lifestyle modifications and adding medications that can reduce the amount of protein in their urine. We know that patients who have a high creatinine and who have progressive kidney disease, as you'll see in a later slide, they have worse mortality. But if they also have albuminuria, the two work more than 1-to-1. So 1 + 1 = more than 2 if you have albuminuria and a rising creatinine. So they're really albuminuria is really a harbinger of badness. These are common studies that you'll see when you're looking through patients' charts that we sometimes order and other people order to give us a sense of what's going on with the kidneys. So far I've told you about blood tests that we can order and urine tests that we can order, but these are other ways that we look at kidney function. Ultrasound probably being the most common. A term that you'll see if you're reading through the reports are echogenic or echogenicity. So kidneys that are highly echogenic on ultrasound, that just means that they're scarred down and fibrotic. So if they're fibrotic and small, to somebody reading that generally means their kidney disease is pretty advanced because they're starting to show anatomic changes of a shrinking kidney. MAG3 studies, this is something that we do much less frequently, but you may see it come up in patients' charts. It's more or less done to show how well each kidney is being perfused by blood and then turning that blood into waste products in urine. CAT scans, anyone who's looking at renal cell carcinoma will be looking at CAT scans quite a bit. This is the best way that we have to evaluate masses on the kidney. And then angiography, so people who have very high blood pressure, so-called resistant hypertension, sometimes we will do angiography where we'll inject dye, the interventional radiologist will inject dye into those arteries that I showed you. And sometimes it shows that those arteries are narrower than they should be, which causes high blood pressure. So just different studies that you may come across when you're looking at kidney patients. Some of you may see kidney biopsies in going through patients' chart. We'll kind of get to why we do those later. We don't do, certainly for all of the patients that we see, very few of them do we perform kidney biopsy on, but it's actually when we go in and puncture that structure that I showed you to actually get a little piece of tissue to show us how the microscopic filtration system is working. It's just a neat picture. We like to show pictures of the glomerulus. So this is the electron microscope view of a kidney biopsy. This is the tuft of the glomerulus that you saw at the top of that nephron structure. So this is basically a huge ball or tuft of blood vessels or capillaries. And these tiny little so-called foot processes here, this is the filtration system. And so as your blood is on the other side of that, the good stuff stays inside and the bad stuff is pushed through these small window-like slits into the urinary space, and that is what comes out. But when you start to look at patients with pathology, you start to see that these foot processes, which are supposed to be very tightly junctured together, they start to widen. And that is the microscopic reason why we start to see protein and other things in the urine that shouldn't be there. It's because the filtration system is off. The most common cause of damage to the glomerular structure, diabetes, which probably many of you have dealt with. So first, fluid regulation. I put this word juxtaglomerular apparatus up here because we love to talk about it in nephrology. It's the source of a hormone called renin, which probably many of you have worked with, or if any of your patients are on ACE inhibitors, you deal with. This is how the kidney helps the body deal with blood pressure through a fluid regulatory mechanism. So the kidney's smart enough that if it recognizes that either there's too low of a pressure hitting the kidney or there's too low of a salt concentration hitting the kidney, this is one of the hormonal functions that it engages in, and that is this apparatus, which sits next to the glomerulus, releases renin. And renin really has two major effects on the body. If you remember, its goal is to help patients maintain a blood pressure, and it only is released when the blood pressure is low. And so its two effects when it kicks in is to increase the blood volume to raise blood pressure, and also tighten up all the blood vessels. So if we're increasing the volume in the blood vessels or in the pipes, and we're squeezing down on the pipes, that's going to increase blood pressure. As you'll see later down the road, we actually work to reduce this hormone because we don't want our patients to get high blood pressure. But physiologically, it's meant to help people who are in a bad situation and are dealing with low blood pressure. The collecting duct, this is the last part of the nephron that I showed you, the tail end, where the waste products are about to get dumped into the ureter and then exited through the bladder. The other way that the kidney regulates fluid in addition to the hormonal renin release is through what's called antidiuretic hormone, sometimes called vasopressin. Basically, this is how the body regulates its sodium. So for all those sodium labs you look through, we think of sodium as really the body's concentration of water, not so much the concentration of sodium. And that's because that's how the kidney thinks of it. So if the kidney thinks that either the sodium concentration is too high in the blood or that the patient needs more extra intravascular volume, it will basically insert these pores into the nephron to suck back as much water as possible. Two obvious effects of this. So you probably have experienced when you are hiking or you're in a situation where you haven't had much water for many, many hours. Your urine is very dark, it's very concentrated. And this is the direct result of antidiuretic hormone working. So as you're out hiking and you're not drinking water, your kidneys are smart enough to realize that we need to conserve as much water as possible because you're also losing water through sweat. And so the antidiuretic hormone is jacked up and all these additional pores are put in the nephron so that as the waste products are filtering all the time through your kidney, it's pulling back as much water as possible. And so if the waste product then has very little water in it, that turns out to be very concentrated and very dark. Whereas if you're sitting and you're drinking coffee all day and water bottles all day and you go to urinate, it's going to be very clear. And that would mean that the ADH system is turned down because your body has plenty of water and doesn't need to hold on to it. This is just to show you where the two different fluid regulation mechanisms work. So renin is released at the glomerulus. The glomerulus you can think of as kind of the pressure sensor of the kidney. This is where low blood pressure is detected. And then here at the tail end, this is where urine concentration happens. So after a long 8-hour hike of one water bottle with making concentrated urine, that's a direct result of the collecting duct doing its thing and pulling back as much water as it can. Any questions before I move on? Cool. So this is nephrologists love the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. This is where the hormone renin that I talked about really has its effect. And as you'll see later, this is really where ACE inhibitors or angiotensin receptor blockers or ARBs exert their effect to lower blood pressure. So angiotensin is made in the liver and it doesn't really have an effect until it gets to the end of this activation process when it becomes angiotensin II. The liver makes angiotensinogen, and the kidney produces this hormone called renin, which I just mentioned a couple of minutes ago. And renin's job is to convert angiotensinogen to angiotensin I. Angiotensin I has some effects, but the effects of angiotensin II are much more potent than angiotensin I. And so the lungs get involved and they generate angiotensin converting enzyme, or ACE. This is where ACE inhibition comes from. So ACE inhibitors block the effect of the angiotensin converting enzyme, which actually comes out of the endothelial cells in the lung. We do this because angiotensin II has 5 different effects, all of which work to increase blood pressure. As I mentioned before, this is how renin's exerting its blood pressure raising effects on the body. So all of these 5 things work to help raise the blood pressure in your body. If you hold on to more sodium and chloride, your blood pressure will go up. Increased sympathetic activity, this is your fight or flight response. So increased sympathetic activity causes the blood vessels to clamp down, increasing blood pressure. Aldosterone is secreted. Aldosterone also causes your body to hold on to extra salt. Vasoconstriction I mentioned, and then if you remember this antidiuretic hormone, this is the collecting duct hormone that pulls back all the water. So all these result in increased blood pressure, and you can see why we would be very keen to inhibit this enzyme so that patient's blood pressure would not potentially be so high. I put this up here. Does anyone know what this is? This is, someone said it? Yeah, so this is Frank Lloyd Wright's probably most famous structure. It's called Falling Water. It's in western Pennsylvania, where actually I think today a very special election is going on. I think I put this up here because if you interact with nephrologists on any extended period of time, you'll find that we're very similar in personality. I think it's safe to say. All of us generally have a love of chemistry, and all of us have a love of things making sense. And you'll see as we delve into one layer deeper into the nephron how really if you understand kidney physiology, all of the pathophysiology, all of the electrolyte abnormalities that we see on lab tests, we can pretty much sort out in our heads why that's happening and what's causing those things to happen. So some people see this and they think this is the sand monster from the movie Dune, but it's actually not. This is my rendering of a nephron from a couple of years ago. This is just meant obviously not to be written down or memorized, but to convey, one, how smart we think the kidney is, and two, how we understand the form and function of how the nephrons work, and because of that, we've been able to go in with therapeutics and pharmacotherapy treatments to actually intervene. And you'll see how all the different blood pressure medicines that we use, both in nephrology and in other fields, actually work on the nephron. So it doesn't look nearly as pretty, but this is the glomerulus here. Again, the pressure sensor and the great filter of the kidney. And then this is the tubules going through. This is the end collecting duct where the urine is coming out, if you remember, just to orient you. The kidney has 4 different major parts. The first is the proximal tubule. Each of these parts, the reason I show this is accurate, but the reason I show this is just to give you a sense of how the electrolyte regulation is going on all the time in your kidney. The brown side of this diagram, this is the inside of the tubule. This is where what we call the urinary space, or where all the waste products that the kidney is trying to get rid of, this is where they flow. The white part of the diagram, these are the cells lining the kidney tubule. So these are the intelligent cells that are deciding, do I need to reabsorb sodium? Do I not need to reabsorb sodium? And then the red side, this is the blood. So if you imagine the waste products are in the urine, the cells are deciding whether or not those waste products need to be pulled into the blood or secreted from the blood into the urine. But this is just a common diagram structure that we use. The loop of Henle, this is where a lot of the concentrating power of the urine happens. Again, urinary space, kidney cell, blood. This sodium potassium 2-chloride transporter is probably the most famous in the kidney because it's where Lasix works. So with patients with huge lower extremity edema or pulmonary edema, usually one of our go-to medications to get rid of that fluid is Lasix. And so Lasix basically acts on this transporter and turns it off. And so all of that sodium, potassium, and chloride and all of the water stay in the urinary space and get peed out. Whereas if the Lasix wasn't there, it would continue to get absorbed. Does anyone know the term, maybe the person from cardiology knows where the term Lasix came from? It stands for last 6 hours. So the half-life of Lasix is about 6 hours, and we dose Lasix twice a day, but its main activity hangs around for about 6 hours. The collecting tubule, this is a little bit out of order, but this is the last segment of the kidney, again, where the kidney decides, I have this waste product that's about to be exited from the body in urine. Do I need any of that water back? And so below each of these segments, I've just listed the drugs that we have. Most are antihypertensives and which section of the nephron they work on. The distal convoluted tubule is probably the second most famous, and that's because thiazide diuretics work there. These are drugs that are not as potent as Lasix, but they achieve the same goal. They basically shut down this transporter, this hydrochlorothiazide acts here at the sodium chloride transporter and shuts it off. And so all the sodium and chloride and water stays within the urinary space and gets peed out. This is, I think the other reason why I put this up here is if you, though I definitely cannot draw this from memory yet, it is a life goal, but you can start to understand why, if you understand the physiology and the function, you can follow the form and the electrolytes and the pathophysiology when things in the nephron go wrong. Oh, this is just to show you also how, if you understand how the renin-aldosterone system works, it makes sense that ACE inhibitors and ARBs are used for lowering blood pressure because they stop the conversion, this last step conversion here, which causes all of these blood pressure raising effects. So for those of you who hated chemistry, I apologize. For those of you who liked it, you're welcome. This is, I put this up here for two reasons. One, because this is one of the kidney's main functions in dealing with how the salts in your body are regulated. It's really the main organ that takes care of all this. And I think while all of us study this at some point in our careers, the kidney is thinking about this all the time. And we go about our day eating whatever we want, drinking whatever we want. But these electrolytes have real clinical consequences when things are not working so well in the kidney. I just highlighted the most common here that you'll see. This basically just looks like a Chem 7 when you think about labs that you see. So sodium, potassium, magnesium, calcium is regulated obviously at the kidney as well. Hydrogen, I put that there because protons are acidic, and the kidney's third function is regulating acid base. Chloride, obviously. And phosphorus. Christi will probably touch on this, but basically everything that has a flake or is a bread product, dark chocolate, dark cola, has tons of phosphorus. And so when people lose their kidney function, like dialysis patients, they are not able to handle phosphorus loads like everybody else. And she'll probably get to this, but long-term perturbations in your phosphorus end up really negatively affecting your bone. And so we are constantly on our dialysis patients about watching their phosphorus. But as you'll see, food that dialysis patients can't eat is really all the good stuff that we enjoy. And so I think while this is something we study and we find it interesting, for patients with kidney disease, this is sometimes life and death, but it's certainly a daily consideration. So I put these up here just for a more human approach. So here's sodium chloride, something that's in basically everything we eat, whether we know it or not. Everyone knows that bananas are chock full of potassium. This is when people lose their kidney function, they lose the ability to regulate potassium. And so when you have no kidney function, everything that you put in has to come out. And if you're not urinating it out, then it's just building up in your body. And so we use dialysis to take care of clearing all of these electrolytes. But somebody who loves bananas, who has no kidney function, can get into real trouble if their potassium rides up too high, and we see that all the time. Something local to our state, avocados are also chock full of potassium, so are mangoes. So kind of all the good citrus fruits that you like, orange juice, these things are full of potassium, and our patients who don't have preserved kidney function have to think about this. Cheese obviously has lots of calcium and phosphorus. This is not meant to go through, but just to drive home the point that your body really has two ways of keeping your pH or your acid-base status where it should be. I think we all remember that the pH of our bodies operates in a very, very tight physiologic range, and it doesn't take a whole lot for people to get in trouble if their pH changes in one direction or another too much. And the kidney, along with the lungs, is really the primary organs that keep your body in the pH range that makes it happy and make all the enzymes function well. So I talked about bone mineral metabolism. This is the fourth function that your kidneys take care of. This is not so much building bone, but this is regulating the calcium balance in your body. Most of your calcium stores live in your bone, and so to get calcium into the blood from the bone, the kidney plays a role in that. Phosphorus balance I talked about. We'll get into that a little bit more. And then vitamin D activation. So I would bet that for those of you who have seen your primary care doctor in the last year, that probably half of you have had your vitamin D checked by your primary care doctor. This is a pretty common test. There are 3 different forms of vitamin D, and sometimes we get labs of the wrong kind of vitamin D. But the kidney plays a huge role in regulating how the bones give up or take back calcium and phosphorus. Oops, sorry. The last function is the production of red blood cells. And so this is very simplified, but it hits everything and I think drives the point home. So if you think of red blood cells as being the final product, this is what drives your hemoglobin up to 14, 15, or down if you're not making enough red blood cells and you become anemic. As everyone knows, the red blood cell's job is to deliver oxygen throughout the body, so all the organs get the oxygen that they need to carry out all their functions. The kidney, in addition to sensing the blood pressure and the pressure that's pushing on the glomerulus, that same apparatus has a different chemical structure that senses how much oxygen is in the blood. And the kidney uses this to decide whether or not the body needs to generate more red blood cells. So if you're not carrying enough oxygen, the kidneys think, well, it's probably time to make more blood so that more oxygen can be carried to all the organs. And so the kidneys generate this hormone called erythropoietin, which most people know as EPO or darbepoetin. These are the 2 pharmacotherapies that we give to our dialysis patients who no longer make erythropoietin. But I think it probably makes sense that these arrows should only be one directional. I'm sorry about that. Probably makes sense that if the kidney's not making erythropoietin or not making enough EPO, that the bone marrow then doesn't get the signal to make red blood cells. And so as people's kidney function starts to decline, this erythropoietin amount starts to decline. Bone marrow then starts to produce fewer red blood cells and kidney patients become anemic, which is, for anybody who's dealt with kidney patients, is a very common thing that you'll see. I think we have time. I think there's a great 3.5-minute TED Talk that goes through what I just talked about in a nice summary, and I'll give you a break from my voice.
It's a hot day, and you've just downed several glasses of water, one after the other. Behind the sudden urge that follows are 2 bean-shaped organs that work as fine-tuned internal sensors. They balance the amount of fluid in your body, detect waste in your blood, and know when to release the vitamins, minerals, and hormones you need to stay alive. Say hello to your kidneys. The main role of these organs is to dispose of waste products and to turn them into urine. The body's 8 liters of blood pass through the kidneys between 20 and 25 times each day, meaning that together, these organs filter about 180 liters every 24 hours. The ingredients in your blood are constantly changing as you ingest food and drink, which explains why the kidneys need to be on permanent duty. Blood enters each kidney through arteries that branch and branch until they form tiny vessels that entwine with special internal modules called nephrons. In each kidney, 1 million of these nephrons form a powerful array of filters and sensors that carefully sift through the blood. This is where we see just how refined and accurate this internal sensing system is. To filter the blood, each nephron uses 2 powerful pieces of equipment, a blob-like structure called a glomerulus, and a long stringy straw-like tubule. The glomerulus works like a sieve, allowing only certain ingredients, such as vitamins and minerals, to pass into the tubule. Then, this vessel's job is to detect whether any of those ingredients are needed in the body. If so, they're reabsorbed in amounts that the body needs so they can circulate in the blood again. But the blood doesn't only carry useful ingredients. It contains waste products too, and the nephrons have to figure out what to do with them. The tubules sense compounds the body doesn't need, like urea, left over from the breakdown of proteins, and redirects them as urine out of the kidneys and through two long sewers called ureters. These tubes empty their contents into the bladder to be discharged, ridding your body of that waste once and for all. There's water in that urine too. If the kidney detects too much of it in your blood, for instance, when you've chugged several glasses at once, it sends the extra liquid to the bladder to be removed. On the other hand, low water levels in the blood prompt the kidney to release some back into the bloodstream, meaning that less water makes it into the urine. This is why urine appears yellower when you're less hydrated. By controlling water, your kidneys stabilize the body's fluid levels. But this fine balancing act isn't the kidney's only skill. These organs have the power to activate vitamin D to secrete a hormone called renin that raises blood pressure, and another hormone called erythropoietin, which increases red blood cell production. Without the kidneys, our bodily fluids would spiral out of control. Every time we ate, our blood would receive another load of unsifted ingredients. Soon, the buildup of waste would overload our systems and we'd expire. So each kidney not only keeps things running smoothly, it also keeps us alive. Lucky then that we have two of these magical beans.
That was part of a larger, I think, hour-long TED Talk about, basically went through each organ system in that, I think, very succinct way. I kind of wish we had those when we were going through med school. Now the next one's playing, hold on.
Hi, kids.
I thought I'd take just a 2-minute departure from the lecture and just kind of make this real for people as far as how all of this physiology actually plays out when we're seeing patients in clinic. When Christi and I were first years, and actually second years too, there was a young gentleman who was 22 who would present to the ER about once a month or maybe once every 6 weeks. And his presenting symptom would be complete weakness and inability to breathe. It was much more than shortness of breath. And it turns out when this gentleman would get to the ER, depending on how long he had let his symptoms go, a few times he needed to be intubated so he could get that much help with his breathing. And all this was driven because his potassium and his magnesium were exceedingly low to levels where he became very sick. So people know that when your potassium gets out of whack, you sometimes get lower extremity cramping. Some people get palpitations. But in very low potassium and magnesium situations, people get extremely weak. And the reason why his potassium and mag were so low is because part of his nephron, the part of the nephron that I showed you in the loop of Henle that takes care of absorbing potassium and magnesium, it was off. He has a syndrome called Barter's disease where he is not able to reabsorb potassium and magnesium in the normal way, and so he inappropriately wastes all of his potassium and mag in his urine. And so he's on whopping doses of potassium supplementation and magnesium supplementation, but even despite these doses, he's not able to keep his electrolytes at the level where the body is happy. And so he presents to the ER with these profoundly low potassium and magnesium levels, symptoms of being unable to walk, and he has so little potassium and mag, he can't even move his respiratory muscles to breathe. That's why he's short of breath. And so unfortunately, the solution for this young guy potentially could have been transplant, but he needed to get bilateral nephrectomies or both of his kidneys removed in order, because you can't get a transplant right away unless you have a living donor. And so we had no way to get on top of giving him enough potassium and magnesium to keep him out of the hospital. And so there's the plan to get rid of both of his kidneys because they're functioning so poorly. So you can see that when this perfect balance of electrolytes gets out of whack, and Bartter syndrome is an inherited disease that's a really extreme example of this, but it can cause people really significant disease and impact their life significantly. Moving outside of outside of physiology, we'll go to disease. These are terms probably everyone has heard: acute kidney injury, otherwise known as AKI, chronic kidney disease, or CKD, glomerular disease, which you'll find everyone has trouble with pronouncing the word glomerular, even though it sounds like I'm stroking. This falls into both CKD and end-stage renal disease, but this is kidney-specific disease, and that's why I wanted to focus on it, and then end-stage renal disease, or ESRD. I think, as you'll find, the kidney is really an innocent bystander in many situations where people present with a rise in their creatinine or protein in their urine. It is, subject to all of that blood that you saw in the video and that I said constantly. And so systemic diseases, most famously diabetes and hypertension, the kidney gets ravaged by these two diseases, and as you'll see, they're the two most common causes of chronic kidney disease. So acute kidney injury, this is something that we see in the hospital. This is an insult to the injury, an insult to the kidney that only lasts on the order of hours to days, sometimes weeks, but it's usually reversible. It is caused by 3 different primary mechanisms. So either the kidney isn't getting enough blood, it's not getting perfused well enough. This is called pre-renal acute kidney injury. On the other side, the waste products aren't getting excreted effectively. If there's an obstruction downstream in the bladder or the ureter, the kidneys get a backup of all that waste product and pressure, and so that can cause acute kidney injury. And then parenchymal disease, these are diseases that are specific to the kidney tissue and cause acute kidney injury that way. Acute tubular necrosis, you'll hear ATN thrown around quite a bit, both in the hospital and in the outpatient setting. This is when any of the acute kidney injury insults have gone on long enough, the kidney actually starts to shed its tubular cells into the urine, and you can actually see these when you look under the microscope. So it makes sense that if the kidney doesn't get enough blood flow, that the cells within the kidney aren't going to be happy. And so decreased renal perfusion is a common cause of acute kidney injury, and these are just some of the major reasons that I listed up here. So dehydration, heart failure, either too much fluid or too little fluid causes decreased perfusion. Sepsis, so terrible infections, NSAIDs. If you remember nothing else from this talk, it's that NSAIDs are not the kidney's friend, and you really need to ask patients about medications that may not come up on their medication list. NSAIDs taken over long periods of time can actually cause kidney disease and push people onto dialysis from just taking too much ibuprofen for their knee pain for months and years. But they also cause decreased blood flow to the kidney. These we just diagnosed kind of the old-fashioned way with talking to the patient about how much have you been drinking, have you been sick, and doing a volume exam. On the other side, it could be an outflow problem. So if the kidney's trying to generate all this waste and there's a kink in the bladder or the ureter, you're not going to be able to excrete the waste, and so this backup pressure is going to cause injury to the kidney. Kidney stones are a common reason of this if they get lodged in the ureter or further downstream. Genitourinary malignancy, so malignancy of the bladder, malignancy of the ureter. You can imagine the tumor cells end up encroaching in the space and cause backup because it impedes flow. Retroperitoneal disease is just any disease that is in the space around the kidneys that can encroach on the emptying system. Parenchymal disease, these are diseases specific to the kidney. I'll just go through some of them here. So anything termed glomerulonephritis or GN, this is just means inflammation of the glomerulus. So that tuft of cells, the filtration system, gets infiltrated by one disease or another, and the pathophysiologic effects result from the inflammation in the filtration system. Acute interstitial nephritis, or AIN, I put that here because one of the most common causes of AIN are medications, and there'll be a slide on this coming up. Acute interstitial nephritis is basically like an allergic reaction in the kidney that causes kidney ill effects. We've probably all heard of urinary tract infections, but a higher urinary tract infection is called pyelonephritis. This is an infection of the kidney itself. Abscess, obviously, if there's an infection that forms an abscess in the kidney, this can cause acute kidney injury. Infarction, this is when, believe it or not, some people with, say, post-catheterization for their heart, if a clot is flicked off in such a way that those blood vessels perfusing the kidney are blocked, the kidney can actually infarct because it's not getting enough blood. Infarct being just die off, the cells die. And then any systemic diseases, so diabetes, hypertension, lupus, these can all have ill effects on the kidney parenchyma. So like I said, acute interstitial nephritis can be thought of as an allergic reaction in the kidney. The most common cause of AIN are drugs, and we think about drugs as the first three things on the differential diagnosis before we go looking for anything else. Antibiotics are a common offender. Penicillin-like medications are one of the most common offenders. Proton pump inhibitors, you can see these are pretty common drugs. So anyone on Nexium, omeprazole, these types of medications can have this acute interstitial nephritis reaction. Lupus can also cause AIN. HIV can cause AIN. Again, you can kind of see how systemic diseases start to take their effect on the kidney. Multiple myeloma, a form of blood cancer, can have ill effects on the kidney. Moving out a little bit of acute kidney injury, just another take-home point that I'd like to focus on for a minute is think about nephrotoxicity, meaning things that are toxic to the nephron. I'm sure everybody here has dealt with the dose adjustments for whatever pharmacotherapeutic they might be studying in patients with reduced kidney function. Again, I highlight NSAIDs because we don't like NSAIDs. They not only reduce blood flow to the kidney in some situations, but they also can mess with people's potassium regulation. And lastly, they actually cause sustained damage to the kidney tissue itself. So if your patients can use Tylenol, please give them Tylenol. Intravenous contrast, so this is patients who are either getting a radiology study or a cardiac catheterization. There's some debate about this in the kidney cardiology world, but I will not engage in that in this talk because it could be a talk of its own. Generally, patients with kidney disease, we are very careful about how much intravenous contrast we give them because it can cause worsening of their kidney disease. Aminoglycosides are a type of antibiotic. So generally anything that ends in mycin, adriamycin, gentamicin, these drugs are very bad from a kidney perspective. We don't like them. Amphotericin, this is an antifungal medication that's often given to patients with meningitis. We call it amphoterrible on our side because it is hugely toxic to the kidney. And then different forms of chemotherapy, so mainly the platinum-associated chemotherapy, cisplatin, carboplatin, are nephrotoxic. So we often, as nephrologists, will get into the situation where a lot of things can be nephrotoxic, and if our patient needs a chemotherapeutic agent that may be nephrotoxic to the kidney, we'll be asked by the oncology team, what should we do, or how should we approach this? And I think one of the unfortunate things about our organ is that it often takes a back seat to other more pressing things, such as treating cancer or treating heart disease. And part of the reason I think that is because we have a backstop for our organ, which is dialysis. There's no way to dialyze a heart, so to speak, or give somebody a new set of blood-making cells like we can do with dialysis. And so often we have to weigh these considerations, but obviously if our patient needs a chemotherapeutic agent, we will sacrifice their kidneys so that they can live often. So acute kidney injury is something that lasts on the order of days, sometimes to weeks. Chronic kidney disease lasts more on the order of months to years, and you can think of it as a spectrum. So chronic kidney disease precedes end-stage renal disease, which Christi will talk about in a few minutes. Chronic kidney disease is when we hope to pick up kidney disease. We don't like to pick up patients when they're so close to end-stage renal disease. It's hugely prevalent. About 15% of people in the US have one form of chronic kidney disease. These are the most common causes of chronic kidney disease: diabetes, high blood pressure, and CVD is cardiovascular disease. So of all the patients in the US with chronic kidney disease, 40% of them will have diabetes, about a third of them will have high blood pressure, and about 40% will have cardiovascular disease. The greatest predictor of decreased kidney function or decreased GFR, if you remember back to the graph, the percent of kidney function, is age. So there's a natural loss of kidney cells as you age that is completely normal and that most people will never ever feel the ill effects of because they have so much residual kidney function. This is more for my area of interest, but Medicare spending on patients with chronic kidney disease is on the order of $50 billion. To give you some perspective, the NIH budget, complete budget for funding everything we do is $35 billion. So chronic kidney disease is defined as, you can see, an abnormality of structure or function that lasts beyond 3 months. Hypertension, diabetes, we mentioned, are the top causes, and it's important to remember that chronic kidney disease leads to end-stage renal disease. Not in everyone if we do a good job of controlling their progression, but in many people. And the magic GFR or filtration percentage to remember is 60. So when somebody's GFR drops below 60, if you remember back to the y-axis of the graph, they are at a point where we call them stage 3 chronic kidney disease. I put these up just because I thought it was important because these are often used in trial protocols, inclusion-exclusion criteria. These are GFR amounts here, and you can see that anything really below 60, so 59 and below, is where we as nephrologists get concerned that the kidney function is not headed in the right direction. You can see here, it's a long way from 60 to kidney failure, which is defined as less than 15%. What all of these numbers usually play into more than worrying about end-stage renal disease, though, is drug dosing. So somebody with a GFR or a clearance of 20 in the stage 4 range is going to get rid of less medication that's cleared through the kidneys than somebody with more function, say in the 50 to 60 range. Does that make sense? And so often with trials or even with medications that are approved when we're dosing them, the dosing is usually dependent on the GFR level or the stage of chronic kidney disease. I didn't include too many primary data graphs because I didn't think it was really relevant with such a big topic, but this is a graph that we nephrologists have committed to memory. And I put it up here to show how significant and how risky chronic kidney disease is. I think there's an underappreciation in the medical community about, oh, somebody has a GFR of 50 or 40, but their creatinine is fine. This is a study out of the New England Journal from 2004, which actually the chief of our division was a co-author on. And it was the first study that established that as GFR declined, you can see on the y-axis here, that relative risk of mortality rose. Not linearly, but exponentially. And so somebody with a GFR in the 45 to 59 range, if this is your reference, their relative risk of death is 1 or even, you can see that, you know, dropping to this next stage almost increases their risk of all-cause mortality by 5%. So these are why those staging, this is the data where those staging numbers came from, and why, you know, we as nephrologists kind of take them so seriously. It's much more than just a number. We know that those numbers actually correlate to hard outcomes being mostly cardiovascular, but also all-cause mortality. And then this is I think the only other graph I put in here, but It's just to show that in addition to rising creatinine or GFR, this is a graph of albumin. And on the side here, you can see the hazard ratio of all-cause mortality. And so if you remember back to the albumin numbers that we talked about, it was less than 30, 30 to 300, and then greater than 300. And you can see here why those numbers were derived. If you look at 30, there's an increase in the inflection of risk of death as we increase. And so if you combine these two, this is another chart that all nephrologists commit to memory. You can see it's a little complicated, but I think it conveys the point that if you look at the top, these are stages of albuminuria. So less protein in the urine, more protein in the urine. And then these are stages of chronic kidney disease. So very little chronic kidney disease to very bad chronic kidney disease. And the chart, I should say, is pretty self-explanatory. Green is good, red is bad. And so somebody with a GFR in the very low range with lots of protein in their urine is in really bad shape as compared to somebody with, mildly reduced GFR with very little protein. Does this graph make sense? This is one of the big take-home points that I wanted to convey was when you see GFRs and they're combined with albuminuria or protein in the charts that you're looking at, those patients are really dealing with pretty tough odds when it comes to cardiovascular and other causes of mortality. Something that we also hear a lot about, you remember that I talked about the kidneys playing a role in bone mineral metabolism. And so patients who have long-standing kidney disease develop what's called secondary hyperparathyroidism. For those of you who I'm sure learned but may not remember, the parathyroid glands live in the thyroid gland, and their job is to increase the blood's concentration of calcium. And they do that by talking to the bones and getting the bones to release lots of calcium. The kidneys, as they start to fail, suffer from two things. That should say 125 vitamin D, not 123 vitamin D. So as they are making less vitamin D and they're getting rid of less phosphorus, they're doing two things. One, vitamin D talks to the GI tract and pulls in calcium. So if there's less vitamin D around, the blood's going to have less calcium coming in from the GI tract, which is the food that you eat. And as the phosphorus levels start to go up because the kidney's not getting rid of the phosphorus, these signals both go to the parathyroid hormone to tell them the body doesn't have enough calcium. We need to increase the amount of parathyroid hormone that's around. And then the parathyroid hormone goes to the bones and ends up leaching the bones of additional calcium. And you can see how over time, if this went on for years, patients' bone health would suffer. So many patients who end up progressing all the way to end-stage renal disease have significant damage, clinical pathology to their bone structure. I just thought that was important to mention. There's a lot more detail here, but these are just, again, going back to the clinical manifestations of what the kidney does physiologically. So you've heard about what the diseases are. What can we do for them? Our best drug in the armamentarium is ACE inhibitors and angiotensin receptor blockers. In addition to lowering blood pressure, these medications actually take pressure off of the nephron's glomerulus. And so if you think of a hose analogy, if you have a kink in a hose and you decrease the pressure on that kink, the hose will last a lot longer. And so we know that giving our patients ACE inhibitors or ARBs reduces the pressure on the nephron, and so this is the best medication we have to slow the progression of chronic kidney disease. You'll remember I said we can't cure chronic kidney disease, we can't regenerate kidney cells, although maybe in the next 10 years we'll be able to. But right now, the best tool that we have to help our patients is to preserve the kidney function that they have and slow the progression of their kidney disease, and we do that with ACE inhibitors and ARBs. Obviously, if somebody's blood pressure and diabetes is well controlled, then the kidneys will be happier because they're not feeling the ill effects of these types of diseases. Obviously, any chronic kidney disease that's caused by glomerulonephritis, we treat that usually with steroids or other types of immunosuppression. And then anything generally that's good for the heart is also good for the kidneys. So we counsel our patients in the same way that primary care docs and cardiologists counsel their patients in that, you know, the more activity you do and the more weight you lose, the lower salt you intake, your kidneys will be very happy with that. We get asked this question a lot. So if somebody has a GFR of 30, they're not feeling any ill effects. We'll get asked, not by everyone, but by some people, you know, how do you know who's going to progress to end-stage renal disease, and how do you know how long it's going to be before they get to end-stage renal disease? I'll say the jury's still out on this one. There are equations that some people use, some people like, some people don't, that give us a rough estimate of the number of years before a patient progresses from a stage 3A chronic kidney disease to end-stage renal disease. And there are certain factors that we look at that push us in one direction or another. So every person with a GFR of 40 is not at the same risk. If you have a 20-year-old with polycystic kidney disease and no protein in their urine, they're going to have a lot longer time before they progress than somebody who's a bad diabetic with lots of proteinuria, and that's because of that chart that I showed you, that green, yellow, red zone. Hopefully we'll have a better way to get at this in the next 10 years. Yeah? So intolerance could be two things. One is the potassium effects, which you're probably not talking about those, but whenever you start someone on an ACE inhibitor, the natural effect is the potassium goes up, and that's what actually stops more people than the angioedema that I think you're thinking of. Do you know the mechanism of ACE cough? I don't think that's been described. Yeah. I don't know if the cough's been described. So one of the most common reasons why people are taken off of ACE inhibitors, which is probably what you're getting at, is a dry cough. It's not life-threatening, but it's very bothersome to some patients. And it's like I said, one of the most common reasons why we switch people off of ACE inhibitors. But they also get angioedema, where about 5%, maybe 4 to 5% of patients get very, very nasty swelling in their lips and their throat, and can actually progress to anaphylaxis if it's really bad. But that's quite rare. Thanks for bringing up the ACE cough. I had not included that. This I just put up here as another take-home point. So as of now, we don't have a cure for kidney disease. Hopefully we will during our career. But the best that we can do for our patients, both we as nephrologists and you as clinical trial coordinators or people caring for them outside of a nephrologist's office, is to help them keep their kidney disease, to slow the progression as best we can by using ACE inhibitors, controlling their blood pressure, controlling their diabetes. It's a silent disease, as you know. The way we pick it up is by labs. You don't usually get symptoms until the end. We could do a better job, I think, as a medical community at risk stratifying certain patient populations that we think will have kidney disease. We know that certain ethnicities are more prone to kidney disease, and so maybe we could do a better job at reaching out to diagnose these people earlier. Treating hypertension, diabetes, I think, is clear at this point, and then use of ACEs and ARBs as much as possible. I'll try and speed it up so I can get to Christi's section. The two types of glomerulonephritis that I wanted to talk about, you'll hear or read about these. One's called nephrotic syndrome, one's called nephritic syndrome. These are diseases that are specific to the kidney, and they usually result from some type of inflammation that's going on in the glomerulus itself. We treat these with immunosuppressive agents, usually steroids or Cellcept or tacrolimus, things that you see transplant patients on. I think this is your part. It is. I may have just had an extra slide.
Oh, okay. Just real quick, I know this is supposed to be over at 11. Did you all want to take a quick break, or do you want, my part's not going to be very long. Would you rather me just start? Just go ahead. Okay, can you hear me? Okay. So yeah, thank you to Brian who did the bulk of the hard work on this talk and a lot of great explanation. I'm going to talk about end-stage renal disease and transplant. So how many, I know we asked at the beginning, people know people who are on dialysis. How many people have actually seen, like been in a dialysis unit, seen a patient receiving dialysis? Okay. Is there any, before I start, is there any like burning questions that people have about dialysis that I can try to make sure I answer? Or I'll just kind of give a brief overview. Okay, so end-stage renal disease obviously is at the very end of that spectrum that Brian was talking about that kind of starts with acute kidney injury or beginnings of chronic kidney disease, and at the very end of that is near complete loss of kidney function. So basically your kidney can no longer accomplish all those functions that Brian explained. This kind of manifests in a lot of vague symptoms. So other than our blood tests, which obviously we're checking our creatinine levels and following those. One of the other ways that we as nephrologists decide to start dialysis, other than let's say a GFR of around 10, is by these symptoms. So some of the vague symptoms that we think about in patients who are approaching end-stage renal disease are nausea and decreased appetite. That's just from buildup of toxins in the blood. Fatigue is another big one. Again, you can see both kind of vague symptoms, could be from anything. The other thing is itching. So some of the buildup of phosphorus in the blood can cause itching, and shortness of breath as well, which either can be from fluid retention or even anemia, because as the kidneys stop working, the red blood cells aren't produced as effectively. So in addition to those kind of symptoms and the blood tests, that's kind of when we decide to start dialysis. So usually around 10 or so. I do want to note that although we measure creatinine and BUN, those markers in themselves aren't necessarily harmful. They're more just surrogate markers of decreased kidney function. There is something in the blood that accumulates in kidney function that we actually haven't really discovered yet that causes these symptoms. So I just want you all to be aware that the creatinine and the elevated level, yes, is representative of something bad going on, but that in itself isn't necessarily harmful. So some of the other things that patients have difficulty with, and this harkens back to what Brian was talking about, is once your kidney is not functioning well, you retain salt, and with that, blood pressure becomes an issue. Blood pressure becomes more difficult to control in these patients, and also swelling is a problem. Obviously, you're not able to regulate your fluid balance, particularly water balance. So, anything that goes in when you're on end-stage renal disease or you're on dialysis, anything you put in your body is unable to be peed out. So a lot of times we actually will see patients who drink too much water. They aren't able to urinate out that water, and their sodium level in their blood will actually be low because the water kind of dilutes that out. The other thing, the main thing that Brian kind of touched on as well, is a lot of medications are excreted in the urine, filtered out or secreted and urinated out. So it's very important to be aware of dosing and drug dosing in patients on end-stage renal disease. And, kind of it would be beyond my ability to memorize exactly how to dose everything, But on most, drug websites like Lexicomp or UpToDate, there's always a section that says how to dose things for end-stage renal disease patients. And I think that's one of the main things to take away, is to always check to see if you need to adjust the dose of a medication or even a newer medication with a patient on dialysis. And then finally going back to the food intake, so foods that are high in potassium, like bananas, leafy greens, tomatoes, potatoes, or foods that have a lot of phosphorus can also be very damaging to patients on dialysis, so they need to make sure that they watch their intake with that. So just to go over the types of dialysis, the people who know someone on dialysis, what type of dialysis is it? Do you know? And, so hemodialysis. So there's basically two types, hemodialysis and peritoneal dialysis. Hemodialysis, which involves filtering the blood directly, is the most common and actually is what most of our patients are on and what you will mostly see. And hemodialysis can be in-center, so where a patient will go to a facility, whether it be a hospital or a freestanding center like DaVita or a satellite, 3 to 4 times per week for 3 to 4 hours, depending, and receives dialysis that way. Home hemodialysis is hemodialysis, again, involving the blood, but it is where a patient can actually do that at home, and they have to undergo very intense training to do so. And they usually do hemodialysis more frequently. And then peritoneal dialysis, I'll talk about a little bit more. But basically, I have this schematic, which I think is nice. So this one on the left is kind of a very, very simplified schematic of hemodialysis. So basically what happens is you're essentially creating a circuit where you're taking that dirty blood from the patient, the blood that is no longer cleaned by the kidney. You're taking that blood, you're taking it to a dialysis machine where there is a filter. So that dirty blood comes in contact with a filter, and basically you can kind of see that here. The filter is around this side. This is the blood going through. And there's an exchange of kind of the materials that you want to get out. So once that blood flows through, we're able to remove potassium, we're able to remove acids that have built up, phosphorus. We're able to do this by some chemistry and flow of molecules from the blood into dialysis fluid that we prescribe. But basically, it goes through this tube and comes in contact with the filter, and then once the blood is cleaned, the clean blood is returned to the patient. And this is essentially the concept of hemodialysis. And we do this over and over and clean as much blood as we can during a 3-hour or 4-hour span during in-center hemodialysis. Peritoneal dialysis is here on the right, and I think is you may not as commonly see, but it is also another home modality. And basically the difference here is you can see that instead of having this synthetic filter outside the body that we have in hemodialysis, the lining of the abdominal cavity itself serves as a filter. So fluid is placed, dialysis fluid, which we prescribe to have certain components in it, is placed inside the abdominal cavity here and is allowed to sit there for a while. and there is exchange of toxins and molecules across the lining of the abdominal wall. And both the home hemodialysis and peritoneal dialysis allow a patient more flexibility, more autonomy, and actually mimic natural kidney function much more than in-center hemodialysis, which is intermittent. So basically, you're combining what is usually continuous kidney function in a normal person into 3 very limited sessions per week in in-center hemodialysis. So it's not as natural. And the most efficient way to clear the blood is through intermittent hemodialysis. But as I said before, peritoneal and home hemodialysis are a little more natural. And these are just pictures of the different modalities. So at your left upper corner, that's just a picture of in-center hemodialysis, which it sounds like most people are familiar with. And peritoneal dialysis is up on the right with you can see that she has her bag of fluid that she's going to instill in her abdominal cavity. And home hemodialysis, this makes it look very, very like extravagant, but you are able to do things like this, a lot more flexibility. You're able to take your hemodialysis and your machine with you on travel and things like that. So one of the main things that we worry about, or that's a big issue with end-stage renal disease, is vascular access. So because we're cleaning the blood, large amounts of blood in a short period of time, in hemodialysis particularly, we need to be able to access a large blood vessel with high blood flow. So we're taking out much more blood and we're running it through the circuit than we would with like a simple IV draw or blood draw. So the way we do this is kind of by creating a large blood vessel and a high blood flow system. And there's 3 different types of vascular access that we use. The preferred method and the most permanent method is an arteriovenous fistula, which you can see here. So this is basically where surgeons will attach an artery to a vein, and this area where it's connected basically dilates and becomes a very large blood vessel with high blood flow. And during hemodialysis, a needle is inserted into that area, and we're able to withdraw blood and return blood in that area. An arteriovenous graft is similar, except instead of the artery and vein being directly connected, there is a synthetic material that it is in between. And this is usually done in patients that maybe don't have good vasculature that's amenable to surgery. And then finally, central venous catheters, which is what we see initially when a lot of people are just starting out, especially if it's more of an urgent start. And this is in the picture in the bottom. Basically, a large catheter is inserted into the internal jugular vein, which is a large vein in the neck that returns blood to the heart. And that's how we go ahead and establish the circuit. The main complications, predominantly with the central venous catheters, is infection risk. So with catheters or any sort of foreign material in the bloodstream, there is risk for bacteria to seed the bloodstream. And we often have patients who will develop bloodstream infections and may need their catheters removed and replaced while they're receiving antibiotics. So for this reason, central venous catheters aren't really preferred. They're more short-term. But for some patients, they are the only option, specifically patients who have really bad peripheral arterial disease, really bad diabetes, and they just don't have the blood vessels that are that will help develop an arteriovenous fistula. The other complication is thrombosis, or just clotting off of the access. So more so in an arteriovenous fistula or a graft, there can be clotting just because of multiple manipulations and needle poking in the area. So there's buildup of clot there. A lot of patients do have to have interventions on their access while they're on dialysis. And finally, probably the best, oh yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about how long, what's the average amount of time, say, a fistula will last, or even a central line? Problems arise and having to get those replaced, and also the patient.
Yeah, so catheters themselves don't last that long, mainly for the reason being for bacteremia and infection. So it's not uncommon within 6 months or so somebody will come in with a fever, hypotension, and surprise, their catheter's infected. So in that case, we have to remove it, give antibiotics, wait for the bloodstream infection to clear, and then place another one. For AV fistulas, which is more commonly what we use and are more permanent forms of access, most patients have to, at least within like a 5-year period, will have at least, probably 1 to 2 interventions, if not more. And that also will depend on comorbidities. So patients with heart failure, per se, the fistula itself relies on there being blood going through it to stay open. If there's not blood, it's going to clamp down. So in patients who don't have great circulation to begin with, their fistulas may just fail, and they may need, or the blood will stagnate in the fistula, and they may need intervention to remove a clot, or they may need revision of their fistula. We always dread it when we get a phone call, either from the ED or the medicine team, saying a patient's access doesn't work, their dialysis access doesn't work. Because for all the reasons Brian touched on and what the kidney does, this can be very dangerous for the patient. They rely on dialysis, getting it at least 3 times per week. And if they come in and we aren't able to perform dialysis, potassium levels can skyrocket. That can cause problems with heart rhythms. Breathing problems can occur if we're not able to remove fluid. So it is a very urgent situation once access doesn't work. And for the patients, it's also very exhausting and a cause of a lot of angst and hospitalizations as well. Does that? Yeah, sure. So transplant obviously is what the ideal scenario, what we want all of our patients with end-stage renal disease to receive, but obviously we don't have enough kidneys for everyone. Obviously patients who receive a transplant do have better outcomes than those who are on dialysis for obvious reasons. If you actually have a functioning kidney that is working 24/7 and managing your fluids, managing your electrolytes, this is much better than having a kidney or a dialysis performing as your kidney 3 times a week. So patients who receive transplant have much better outcomes than patients on dialysis. The best outcomes occur with patients who actually get what we call preemptive kidney transplants. So patients, once their eGFR dips below 20, we start thinking about transplant and we can put them on the transplant wait list. Some patients already identify a donor, which can be a relative or even a friend. And if everything goes, if everything is a match, they can receive a kidney transplant before they have to go on dialysis, which is actually preferred because you avoid all the complications associated with dialysis. The two types, obviously, is deceased donor kidney transplants and living donor kidney transplants. In the U.S., we do more deceased donor kidney transplants, so kidneys that are harvested from people who have brain death or cardiac death. I think there were about, in 2015, which is the most recent compilation of data that we have, there are about 19,000 transplants done, kidney transplants done in the U.S., and about a third of those were living donors, and the other 2/3 were deceased donors. A deceased donor kidney transplant usually lasts around 10 years because it's taken from an individual who has died, essentially. The kidney itself, even though it goes through rigorous kind of testing, the kidney itself is not as healthy, obviously, as if it's taken from, a healthy living person. So deceased donor kidney transplants usually have a life expectancy of around 10 years, whereas living donors is around 15 to 20. And the main thing we obviously are concerned about with kidney transplants is the complications and the side effects of immunosuppression. So infection risk is kind of the big one. Obviously, in order to maintain a transplant, the immune system has to be dampened down. And with that, you become susceptible to many types of infections, pneumonia, viruses that typically, we wouldn't have any problem with. A normal person wouldn't have any issues. And so patients, in addition to their immunosuppressive agents, need to be on prophylactic or preventive antibiotics as well. If the immunosuppression isn't strong enough, though, the patient is at risk of rejecting their kidney. We can try to salvage this with, steroids and other agents, but sometimes patients will lose their kidney and have to go back on dialysis. And the other big thing is to watch for drug-drug interactions with immunosuppression. So common immunosuppressive agents include steroids. They include anti-metabolite drugs, so something called mycophenolate or azathioprine, and calcineurin inhibitors, tacrolimus, and cyclosporin are the other mainstays of kidney transplant and really any transplant. So these drugs in general have a lot of interactions with other drugs. So some antibiotics, for instance, antifungal agents like fluconazole or any azoles, and some clarithromycin, which is another antibiotic, and even some blood pressure pills can increase the level of the immunosuppressive agents, so you have to watch out for the dosing. Other medications like anti-seizure drugs can actually decrease the level of the immunosuppressive medications and put a patient at risk of rejecting the kidney if the levels drop too low. So really kind of the main thing is if you are dealing with a kidney transplant patient, just take that extra minute or so and make sure there's no interaction with a drug that maybe is going to be administered. It's really easy to just Google a drug interaction and check that. The other thing is just nephrotoxicity. I think someone had asked about with these agents. The main nephrotoxicity specifically with agents called tacrolimus or cyclosporin, these agents actually cause the blood vessels to constrict and clamp down. So if levels in the blood get too high, for instance, they're prescribed a medication that causes the levels to rise, or we're just not getting the dose right. Patients can develop high blood pressure. They can also even have their creatinine rise. They can develop acute kidney injury. And that's because essentially the blood flow to the kidney is reduced because those blood vessels are clamping down. The other thing that these agents can cause is elevated potassium in the blood as well, as that's another complication. And then some agents also can cause protein to leak into the urine and cause hyperlipidemia or cholesterol elevation, poor wound healing. So it's a lot of things to be aware of. But the main thing I would say is that there is risk with acute kidney injury with the calcineurin inhibitors, which are one of the main immunosuppressive agents. And usually when that happens, we just need to reduce the dose. We would never just stop it. And then any questions about that? That's a very fast overview, and I know you've been here a while. Any questions about transplant, dialysis? Yeah. So I was actually looking at that just in case you asked that question. So there's data up till 2015. So deceased donors at around 10 years, about half of people will have to go back on dialysis. That's lower for living donors. It's about a third at 10 years. So obviously that's just a roundabout number, but that's kind of where we get the life expectancy for deceased donors at 10 years, and then 15 to 20 for living donors. Anything else? Any other questions? And then, yeah, we'll just really briefly to talk about, I guess, our research. I just wanted, here was very nice to talk about how my focus is on global health, kidney global health, and I won't waste your time, but basically, if anyone is interested in this, please talk to me. There's going to be almost 6 million people by 2030 that are going to be in dialysis across the world, dialysis or kidney transplant. The main issues being that there's not enough availability of this therapy across the world, and it's very costly for people. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done increasing accessibility to renal replacement therapy across the world. And this is just a picture showing that the blue areas are where there's very few people receiving a dialysis or a kidney transplant. So you can see Africa, India, which is where I do a lot of my research. And then the United States, Europe, Australia is where a lot of people are receiving dialysis. And this is reflective of people on dialysis, but not reflective of the number of people that need dialysis. So there's often a disparity there. So my main goal is to try to, explore this a little bit more and influence kind of health policy change in these countries to increase availability of dialysis. Thank you. And then Brian's just gonna, yeah, go ahead. Oh, here.
So main thing is think about the kidneys when you're looking at medicines, when you're prescribing treatments to patients in your trials. Think about nephrotoxicity. There's a lot of, I think, unnecessary kidney disease that results from the kidney not being at the forefront of people's minds. Don't forget to dose adjust medications, as Christi was talking about, for patients with reduced kidney function. don't forget that chronic kidney disease and especially ESRD are huge cardiac risk factors. Like I said, we all know high lipids and high blood pressure are cardiac risk, but kidney disease, if you remember the chart, huge cardiac risk factor. And I think, if anything, hopefully Christi's mentioned about how our dialysis patients live, gave you an appreciation for their quality of life. So when you're interacting with them either over the phone or in person in the office, just have an appreciation for kind of what they're going through, just so that they can maintain normal, close to normal kidney function. And detect people early. We can save a lot of people starting on dialysis if we think about risk stratifying certain groups in the population and just checking their kidney function by a very simple blood test. We could, I think, prevent a lot of disease. So thanks so much for your attention. I know we talked quite a bit. Happy to take questions at the end, too.
Anything?
Just a reminder to sign the sign-in sheet. Who has it? Make sure that you sign in, and then I'll be sending out an evaluation for today's class, so your feedback is always welcome. Let us know if you have any more questions or topics that you want to see in the future. Thank you.
Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, guys. Thanks for sitting through a medical school lecture. Hopefully it was helpful.